Hey guys, welcome to section 2 of the task list for the 5th edition for the BCBA. Thank you guys for choosing Puzzle Me Academy to guide you in your learning journey for the exam. I really do hope that this video finds you well. And this is a continuation of section 1. So this is section 2. So if you haven't watched the video for section 1 yet, go ahead and go into our channel and watch that section as well. And thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that this study material is useful for you and your study journey. Alright, and for section 2 applications, these are the particular letters that we're going to be targeting, which is all the rest of the material. Section E for ethics, section F for behavior assessment, Section G, behavior change procedures. Section H, selecting and implementing interventions. And Section I, personnel supervision and management. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into Section E for ethics, the ethics code for behavior analysts. So just make sure that you guys review your ethics code based on the BCaBA. This video is only going to go briefly into each of the topics that are going to be discussed in the ethics that is in the board. So if you go into the BCaBA page, you're going to be able to see the ethics code for behavior analysts, and it's going to be very detailed there. So in this video, we're really just going to touch bases with the ethics code. Section E1. Introduction. So some main points that you have to know about the introduction of the ethics codes for behavior analysts is that there is a diverse group of professionals who work in a variety of practice areas that deliver ABA services to positively impact lives. So you also want to consider the scope of the code. This applies to the behavior analysts in all their professional activities, including direct service delivery, consultations, supervision, training, management, editorial, and peer review activities, research, and other activities within the ABA profession. And then there's also the core principles. And there's 4 foundational principles. Benefit others, treat others with compassion, dignity, and respect, behave with integrity, and number 4, ensure their competence. Another section that we're going to be covering through the ethics is going to be the application of the code. There needs to be an understanding with the code. You need to know that it exists. And this is what you're going to be using in order to know how to solve an issue if it were to come into place. Also, how to address the code violations accordingly. Also, ethical decision making, document essential information, confidentiality in preparation and storage of all your documentation. And lastly, you want to understand the terms in the ethics section. So there's many terms, they're all listed here, but these are all terms that are defined and explained in your ethics code. So once again, this is just an overall summary of the stuff in the ethics section. But you are going to have to go ahead and read the ethics code that you're going to find in the BCaBA to be able to get more information on the codes. Alright guys, so E2, responsibility as a professional. This is going to be the first section, section 1 of the ethics standards. So like I said, I'm not going to go into detail with each one of the parts of the sections of the ethics codes, but I have them here listed. These are all the ethics codes from 1.01 to 1.16 that you'll be seeing for the responsibility as a professional. I just want to generally talk about this section and about the things that you would be seeing in the task list. in the ethics standards, in the ethical codes for behavior analysts. So basically you'll see being truthful. So of course, as behavior analysts, we need to be truthful. You'll see the confirming with legal and professional requirements, having accountability, practicing within a defined role, practicing within scope of competence, maintaining competence, cultural responsiveness, diversity, non-discrimination, non-harassment, awareness of personal biases and challenges, multiple relationships, giving and receiving gifts, coercive and exploitative relationships, romantic and sexual relationships, responding to requests, and self-reporting critical information. So if you do want more information and you want some examples of all of these type of materials, we do have all of this available on our website, and we have live sessions, so you can join us or follow us on Instagram, and we do go into detail with all of this stuff. Section E3, responsibility in practice. So this section is going to give you information on how we have to be responsible in our practice, how we're able to provide effective treatment, and how we have to prioritize our clients, their rights, their needs in service delivery, our timeliness, so how important it is to carry out whatever schedule it is that we start to implement as behavior analysts. Protecting confidential information. It's really important to make sure that you protect your client and you maintain their information and maintain their confidentiality. Disclosing confidential information and how important it is knowing who and in what circumstances it is allowed to be able to disclose confidential information. Documentation protection and retention, accuracy in service billing and reporting, the fees that we're able to implement in practice, and all this information and how we have to share it and with who. Communicating about services. It's very important to communicate about our services in an understandable language and ensure that there's comprehension of all the material with the clients, with the stakeholders, supervisees, trainees, and research participants. We have to make sure we involve the clients and stakeholders in our treatment plans and make sure they understand so we can have a service relationship that entails them selecting goals and understanding how the assessments work and how they're designed, as well as collaborating with colleagues and obtaining informed consent. You also want to understand considering medical needs, selecting, designing, and implementing assessments, selecting, designing, and implementing behavior change interventions, minimizing the risk of behavior change interventions, describing behavior change interventions before implementation, collecting and using data, continual evaluation of the behavior change intervention, addressing conditions interfering with service delivery, and that would be all of section E3, responsibilities in practice. So once again, make sure you guys read your ethics code. So this is section E4, responsibility to clients and stakeholders. Here in the bulletins, you see all the parts of this section from 3.01 to 3.16 with all the things that we have to take into consideration towards our responsibility to our clients and understanding stakeholders, when we're able to accept clients, in what circumstances, understanding our scope of competence, and when we're able to accept clients based on whatever it is that they need to be provided to them, our service agreements, financial agreements, consulting with other providers, third-party contracts for services, responsibility to the clients with third-party contracts for services. In this section, we're also going to see information on communicating with stakeholders about the third-party contracted services. We're going to see limitations of confidentiality, the documenting professional activities, advocating for appropriate services, the referrals, facilitating continuity of services, appropriately discontinuing services, and appropriately transitioning services. And here we have section E5, responsibility to the supervisees and trainees. So in your ethical codes, this would be section 4. And you're going to see from 4.01 all the way till 4.12, all these bulletins here. And it's in order. And these are the things that you're going to be reading in your ethical code. And you need to become very familiar with all this information. So the compliance with supervision requirements, supervisee competence. This is all the supervision and supervisee stuff. Supervisory volume, the accountability and supervision, maintaining the documentation, providing of the services and of the supervision and training, incorporating and addressing diversity, performance monitoring, feedback. All this stuff is very important. Delegation of tasks, evaluating effects of supervision and training, facilitating continuity of supervision, and appropriately terminating supervision. So section E6 on the task list is responsibility in public statements. This would be section 5 in the ethics code for behavior analysts, and it will go from 5.01 all the way to 5.11. And you're going to be focusing on protecting the rights of the clients, confidentiality in public statements by behavior analysts, the public statements by others, the use of intellectual property. We want to make sure that behavior analysts are knowledgeable about and comply with the intellectual property laws, being able to obtain permission and use materials that have been trademarked or copyrighted. We want to be able to use advertising of non-behavioral services and understand that we do not advertise non-behavioral services as behavioral services. Soliciting testimonials from current clients for advertising, using testimonials from former clients for advertising, using testimonials for non-advertising purposes, social media channels and websites. This is very important right now, especially in the times that we're living, that everybody likes to use social media. Using digital content in public statements as well. And lastly, section E7, responsibility in research. So this is the last part that you're going to be able to read in detail in your ethics codes that describes all the responsibilities that we have to follow in research, that you have to confirm with the laws and regulations. You have to have research reviews, research and service delivery, informed consent in research, confidentiality, competence in conducting research, the conflict of interest, appropriate credit, plagiarism, documentation and data retention, accuracy and use of data. And that's all for the ethics section. So once again, make sure you guys read your code. And if you want more information, more examples, more detail about the ethics section, just go into our website and we give you guys a whole live session on ethics. Section F, behavior assessment. Let's get to it. So section F1 is review records and data available data, educational, medical, historical, at the outset of the case. So before you start with the case, you need to review all the relevant factors such as medical history, biological history, educational history. You need to rule out the possibility of any biomedical variables being the case of the behavior change before you begin. This is the first step. So whenever you want to know what the first step in your behavioral assessments is this one. You have to rule out any possible medical or any medical, historical, or educational data. You have to be able to have that data before you start with your case and review all that information. Section F2, determine the need for behavior analytic services. So based on the preliminary assessment, you can determine the possible needs for behavior analytic services. You knock out historical data, you determine possible simple environmental changes, and look for socially significant behaviors that can be changed applying behavior analytic procedures. So this is when you're doing the preliminary assessment. So this is basically when you're on that first phone call with the parent or whoever the individual is that made a referral to you, and you're getting that basic information. So here you're able to determine the need for behavior analytic services. You can start knocking things out and determining if behavioral analytics services is right for this client or not. Section F3, identify and prioritize socially significant behavior change goals. So here we went on and talked about the indirect assessment. So this would be interviews. So you would do interviews with the client, the stakeholders. You want to brainstorm some target behaviors, identify some potential goals. This is when you're going through the screening process. You're looking for socially significant behaviors. You're using your applied. You could do checklists, which would be like rating scales, questionnaires, adaptive behavior scales, the child behavior checklist, FAST, MAS, QABF. All of these are indirect assessments. So these kind of assessments allow us to be able to identify and prioritize socially significant behaviors and establish goals and what is important that we work on first. What can we work on next? Here we have section F4, conduct assessments of relevant skill, strengths, and deficits. So there's many assessments that we can conduct in order to determine skill, strengths, and deficits. So repertoire, this is your toolbox. This is everything the client already knows how to do. And with this, we're able to determine if there's a skill deficit. So a skill deficit would be that they can't do it, something that they literally cannot do. So it's not in the client's repertoire. They don't know how to do it. And then when we're referring to a performance deficit, it's something that's in the client's repertoire, but they aren't doing it. They won't do it, but you know that they've done it before. So in this section, basically, you have to understand that you have to conduct assessments in order to collect data on the relevant skill, strengths, and deficits that the individual has. So you'll determine where is it that their strengths lie and where is it that their deficits are in order to be able to establish your behavior changing plan. Section F5, conduct preference assessment. So we're going to be able to identify effective preferences / reinforcers. So specifically, a preference assessment is identifying something that they like. So we do assessments and we know that they might prefer whatever this reinforcer is. So there's 3 ways that we can do a preference assessment, and it's free operant. And there's 2 that lie under the free operant type of assessment, which would be contrived. And the second one is a natural. So for contrived is that there's a variety of items out, and we kind of have somewhat control of the environment, where we would play around with certain things in the environment and see if they'll go for it. And then there's natural, which would be like their regular everyday environment. We won't touch anything. We're literally just observing the things that they interact with and how much time they spent with each item. Another type of preference assessment is ask. You can literally just ask the significant other, the parents, the stakeholders, the teachers, what their preferences are. What do they enjoy playing with? What is something that they like? Or you can ask them themselves. And the third type of preference assessment is trial-based methods. So there's single stimulus, paired stimulus, and multiple stimulus. When we're referring to the single stimulus, this is the basic one. This is literally, we're presenting one item, and it's, do you like this? Do you want to play with this? How much time do you spend playing with this one item? That'll be single stimulus. One item is presented. Then there's paired stimulus. It's also known as forced choice. So you literally show them 2 stimuluses, so 2 different items, and which one do they choose? So this one or this one? Which one do you want to play with? This one or this one? You give them an option of 2, and they choose one. And then there is multiple stimulus. So this is 3 or more. Stimulus is 3 or more items. And there is a multiple stimulus without. And then there is multiple stimulus with reinforcer. So basically, the one without would be that you give them 3 or more options of different items that they can choose from. And whichever one they pick, you remove, and you don't put it back into the set of, let's pretend there's 5 items. Whichever one they pick first, you won't put it back. So then basically we're creating a preference hierarchy. So this is the one that they chose first. Now we present the next 4, then the next 3, and so on and so forth until they've picked all the toys, and we can order them like a rank. And then multiple stimulus with reinforcer is that we put the one that they originally chose back. So if there was 5 items, they chose 1, we put it back and we display it again, all 5 items, to see if they go back to the original one that they chose. Next, we have reinforcer assessment. So here we're going to really evaluate if it's enough for them to choose it again or to do it again. So there's 3 types of reinforcer assessment. There's concurrent schedules, which we talked about previously before. This is just like the same way as a concurrent schedule is. There's matching law, choices. You're giving them 2 reinforcers and they have 1 choice. Which one do you choose? This one or this one? They're given a choice. Then there's multiple schedules. This is 2 or more schedules for a single response. This is not shown at the same time. This has a clear SD, and we would have some type of behavioral contrast. And then there is progressive ratio schedule. So this is where we evaluate how far you will go, and we would hit a ratio string. So let's see how far we can get them to work with what we are offering them. And here we're going to reach a breaking point. Section F6, describe the common functions of problem behavior. So there's 4 possible functions of a behavior: escape, attention, sensory, and tangible. So here on this little slide that we have here, we have a conditions, an antecedent, a behavior, and a consequence. So for the condition, we have the 4 possible conditions that we can test, which is play, contingent attention, contingent escape, and alone condition. So for the play condition, this would be the control. This is where we're going to have an enriched environment. We're going to give them access to all their preferred activities. So that would be the antecedent. They're going to have access to all their preferred activities available. There's going to be no demand placed on the individual, and they have free access to attention. That would be the antecedent setting that they're going to be dealing with during a play condition. And then the behavior, just for purposes of example, for this, it's tantrum, and the consequence is that the problem behavior is ignored of neutrally redirected. That would be the consequence for a play condition. Then we have a contingent attention condition. For this type of condition, we would be testing for positive reinforcement, so social disapproval. So for the antecedent, we're going to give attention to something else. The behavior, once again, for example purposes, is tantrum. And the consequence for this would be that you provide mild attention. So basically, you're reinforcing that behavior. And you provide a reprimand or a soothing statement. And this is how we would test to see if the individual's function of the behavior is for attention. The next one is contingent escape. This is where we are testing a negative reinforcement. So you place a demand. The antecedent would be a task demand. Once again, behavior tantrum. And the consequence for this would be to remove the demand. And the last type of condition would be alone condition. This would be indicating a sensory and automatic reinforcement. So the antecedent would be low-level stimulation present. The behavior would be tantrum. And then the consequence for this would be that the problem behavior is ignored, or if dangerous, it's neutrally redirected. There's also tangible condition, which would be testing for positive reinforcement. We would use the same thing as contingent attention. And then just keep into mind that if we have an indifferentiated pattern, it means that it's inconclusive or an automatic function. So this is referring to when we're collecting data and alternating treatment design. If the attention, condition, escape, alone, and play are all crossing over each other, then this means that we have either an inconclusive or an automatic function. Section F7, conduct a descriptive assessment of problem behavior. So when we're referring to a descriptive assessment, we're talking about direct assessments. This is where we're going to be pinpointing the target behavior. And we could do this using ABC narrative, ABC continuous, scatter plot, and all these type of assessments use some type of conditional probability. So ABC narrative would be open-ended. This is when we're basically establishing a story. Only when the behavior of interest is observed, it's less time consuming. We would calculate a conditional probability. Another name for it is anecdotal, and it's that you're writing out a story, but it should be done by those who know how to conduct it. If not, we will get useless feedback back. So basically, if you are not well knowledgeable in how to write detailed antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, then this is not a good strategy to use, for example, for like teachers, because these have to be very detailed in order for us to be able to understand what's happening. Once again, it's like literally telling a story. Then there's ABC continuous. This would be like checklist, a specific time period. It's better data. You would also use conditional probability. And you cannot do this unless you already know exactly what the antecedents, the behavior, and the consequences are for the specific target behaviors that you're collecting data on. This would be better to use for a teacher since it's more focused and it's in a checklist process. So basically, ABC continuous data is good to use for when you already have an idea of what the behavior is. So kind of like after you collected data for an ABC narrative. And you already know, and you can create a checklist that says the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences that usually the individual engages in. So next we have a scatter plot is another type of assessment that you can use. So using a scatter plot, you can determine when behavior is happening most often or where the behavior is happening most often. This is gonna be helpful in collecting data during time blocks. So we can determine, hey, okay, the behavior happens more frequently during morning sessions or afternoon sessions or with mom or with dad or with grandma. So scatterplot is good for when we want to know that. What and when and what conditions is the behavior occurring most in, which can help us determine when would be the best time to collect, for example, ABC narrative or ABC continuous data. So when we're referring to conditional probability, this is what we do with ABC data, and it shows the likelihood. It shows a correlation between the behavior and what the function could be based on the ABC data that was collected. Okay, so before I start talking on this slide, I just want you guys to know that for those of you that are doing the BCABA exam, section F8 and F9 are not part of the task list for you guys. So this is for the BCBA, the people who are taking the BCBA exam. But for those who are doing the BCABA, this F8, section F8 and F9 are not part of your task list. So now that we talked about that, section F8, conduct a functional analysis of the problem behavior. So functional analysis is the FA. This is the control. This is where we're going to confirm the hypothesis. So we already collected our indirect assessment. We spoke with the parents, we spoke with the individual, we spoke with the teachers. We have an idea of what the behavior is. We already conducted our direct assessment where we collected the data, us observing the behavior as it's occurring using ABC data. And now we're able to conduct a functional analysis. And this is going to be able to help us confirm the hypothesis. We're going to be able to establish a functional relation. The advantages of a functional analysis is that it allows us to determine the actual function of the behavior. It's a function-based intervention. Makes it more likely that your intervention will be successful. Some disadvantages of the functional analysis is that it's more than likely reinforcing the problem behavior. It may strengthen new behaviors, usually unwanted ones. And it's very difficult to do an FA for behaviors that do not occur frequently. Another disadvantage is that it takes lots of time and staff. And one last thing is that it's unnatural. Section F9, interpret functional assessment data. So the functional behavior assessment. Here, basically, we have it all together so you guys can have an idea of what it looks like all together. So the FBA, functional behavior assessment, this is the overall of what you're doing from when you get the phone call to when you determine the function of the behavior. We will start from here, the indirect. This is telling us more or less what the target behavior is. Here we're going to be using checklists, rating scales, interviews. We're going to be asking questions for anyone who is in contact with the client. We're going to be doing questionnaires. That would be the indirect. We're not directly observing the behavior here. We're getting info from those around. We're getting our history. We're reviewing data from past interventions if there were any. Then we move on to the descriptive assessment. This is when we're going to see, we want to see, show us what it looks like. Here we would be using scatter plots, direct observation, obviously, ABC recording, test, in real life, basically. This is what we see, the facts, right in front of us. And then lastly, we would do a functional analysis at the FA. This is the highest level. This is the control. It's going to involve the conditions, and it's going to test the function of the behavior. Section G, behavior change procedures. All right, guys, get ready for this one. This is going to be a very long section. G1, use positive and negative reinforcement procedures to strengthen behavior. So I'm going to briefly talk about this. There's 5 types of positive reinforcers. It's edible, activity, tangible, social, and sensory. Those are the 5 types of positive reinforcers. There's 2 types of a negative reinforcement. It's escape, and this is when you have to be in something in order to be able to get out of it. So you already have to be in a situation in order to get out of it. So an example of this is when you get wet in the rain, so you go inside. The antecedent would be you're getting wet, you're getting rained on. The behavior is putting up the umbrella, and the consequence would be removing the rain. Then we have avoidance. So the difference between escape and avoidance. Avoidance is something that's more common, and you do not have to come into contact with the contingency in order for you to get out of it. You literally just avoid it. So there's 2 types of avoidance. There's discriminated avoidance, and there's free operant avoidance. So for discriminated avoidance, there is a clear SD that you need to avoid. So there's going to be a signal, basically, that signals you or cues you that you're going to avoid something. And then free operant avoidance is that there's no specific SD. So this is free to do it just because of the likelihood. Section G2, use interventions based on motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. So antecedent interventions are implemented prior to and independent of the target behavior's occurrence. So you could do this by doing antecedent manipulations. You do this before the behavior. You can manipulate the MO. It's basically a proactive approach. So some antecedent interventions are manipulating the MOs, training alternative behaviors, making target behaviors more or less effortful, or changing the environment. Next, we have contingency-dependent antecedent. So stimulus control. The effects of this depend on differential consequences for the target behavior or alternative behavior in the presence or absence of the antecedent. So it depends on the antecedent. Now we have contingency-independent antecedent. This has to do with the MOs. This does not depend on differential consequences for the target behavior. It depends on the MOs. This offers a choice to decrease, escape, maintain behaviors, and it does not care about the consequence. And last thing we have here is the 3 types of antecedent interventions. And they are non-contingent reinforcement, high P request sequence, and functional communication training. These are contingency independent. Section G3, establish and use condition reinforcers. So unconditioned reinforcers would be unlearned reinforcers. No one has to teach you. These are primary reinforcers, primary things that we need, such as sex, food, water, oxygen, shelter, activity, sleep, warmth, decrease in pain. So conditioned reinforcers are learned reinforcers. You learn this. If you didn't know it on your birthday, then it's conditioned. They're also known as secondary reinforcers. This is a secondary relation. You've learned it somehow with them being paired. So basically, in order for you to establish and use a conditioned reinforcer, it's something that has to be paired various times with an unconditioned reinforcer. So various times you would, for example, pair praise or good job on an assignment, or use a candy and then pair it with just praise in order for you to be able to remove the candy as a reinforcer. So any form of pairing and unpairing would be how you would establish a conditioned reinforcer. So how you would condition a reinforcer to be able to use it as a reinforcer. Section G4, use stimulus and response prompts and fading. This would be errorless, most to least to most, prompt delay, stimulus fading. So prompts are defined as a supplementary antecedent SDs that are introduced to evoke desired response when the SD is present. So prompts are something that happen before or during a behavior. If desired behavior does not occur, it is not a prompt. Something else that you have to keep in mind is that a prompt is only a prompt if it can be faded. So first, let's talk about response prompts. Response prompts, they act directly on the response. There's 3 types of response prompts. There's modeling, verbal, and physical. Modeling is basically acting out. You are literally modeling what it is that you want the individual to be doing. Verbal also could be non-vocal, so you don't have to actually say it with your vocal in order to be able to have it be verbal. It could be pointing, it could be a written sign. So verbal, non-vocal, this is another type of response prompt. So it could be a voice, it could be do this, it could be a written sign. And the next one is physical. This is like hand over hand, most to least, full physical, partial physical. So then we have stimulus prompts. These act directly on the stimulus. So there's also 3. There's positional, movement, and redundancy. So positional is basically how close. We're moving something, we're positioning it in a specific way, either putting it closer to them or putting it in a weird position in order to call attention to it. Then there's movement. So this is kind of like clues. Maybe you'll shake it. Maybe you'll lift it up. Whatever it is, that will indicate attention to that specific stimulus. And then there's redundancy. So redundancy is like when you highlight, when you make something stand out, you make it bold. And then we have the fading response prompts. So to fade response prompts, you do most to least, which is where you do the most intrusive to the least intrusive. So maybe you start with full physical, and then you go down to verbal, or maybe you do modeling, and then you use verbal, whatever it is that the individual needs. So you give them as much help as possible, and then you start to remove the help and give them the least amount. Then there's the second one, which is least to most. You begin with minimal cues. So you help them as little as possible. You kind of want to see where they're at with least to most. Also, most to least is referred to as errorless learning. So most to least is when we don't let them come into contact with error. That's why it's errorless learning. And then there's graduated guidance. This is when you remove all physical prompts. So graduated guidance is specifically for physical prompts. So you start with the most intrusive one. So maybe you are literally grabbing them. And and putting your hand over their hand and physically moving their body to what it is that you need them to do. And little by little, maybe you just tap them, so on and so forth. That would be graduated guidance. And then there's delayed prompting. This is like a time delay. You give a cue and then wait for a response. Next, we have removing the stimulus prompts. So you could do stimulus fading, which is a gradual removal. It involves highlighting a physical dimension of the stimulus to draw attention to it. And then there's stimulus shape transformation. This uses initial stimulus shape that will prompt the correct response. So if you're teaching them specific words, maybe like car, you'll have them see a picture of a car and with the word car written inside of the shape of a car, and eventually erase the shape of the car until they're able to just write out the word car. So response prompt hierarchy is all different, but always we will see most to least and least to most. Next we have section G5, use modeling and imitation training. So imitation, there's a couple of steps that you want to consider when you're doing imitation training. There's specific things that you should follow. So imitation training would have formal similarity. They look the same. You would model. The teacher must model the desired behavior. It's important to consider the immediacy. So it has to happen right now. There's a temporal relation that you have to keep into consideration. It should happen within 5 seconds. So behavior is modeled and they should be able to model it right back as soon as possible. The fourth one is controlled relation. The model must serve as the SD for imitative behavior. There's 2 types of models. There's planned models, which is prearranged, and then there's unplanned models, which is like a social interaction. So you follow the people. Basically, this is like when you get to a new place that you've never been before and you see the crowd is all going left, so then you also follow and you go left. That would be an unplanned model. So there's guidelines also for imitation training. It should be active in short sessions. You're reinforcing both prompted and unprompted responses. This is going to help with generalization and maintenance. You want to pair social praise with other reinforcers. And number 4, you want to fade out prompts. An imitative behavior is a new behavior that follows a novel antecedent. For it to be true imitation, it has to be the very first time the individual has come into contact with this behavior. So just keep that in mind. Section G6, use instructions and rules. So instructions. Rules, definition-wise, is a verbal statement explaining a behavioral contingency. When we're talking about contingency-shaped behavior, it's selected and maintained by controlled and temporally close consequences. And when we're talking about rule-governed behavior, this is something that's under the control of a verbal statement explaining the contingency. This is something that allows the behavior to be under the control of temporally remote yet significant consequences. Section G7, use shaping. So this is a process that uses systematic and differential reinforcement of successive approximations to the terminal behavior. You're going to use shaping to teach new behaviors. So these are some things that you want to ask yourself. Did the topography change? If your answer is yes, then we're talking about shaping across topography. Specifically, shaping across topography refers to different topographies, different positions. The form is changing. So if the topography changed, if the form changed, then we're talking about shaping across topography. If your answer is no to topography change, then we're talking about shaping within topography. They have the same topography, and the only thing that's changing is either the magnitude or the duration. Nothing is changing in that form, is just more or less of it. And something else you want to keep in mind is clicker training. It's something that progressively shaping new behaviors using positive reinforcement and extinction. The clicker sound is paired with reinforcers, so the sound becomes a conditioned reinforcer. Section G8, use chaining. So in order for you to be able to do chaining, first you have to conduct a task analysis. This is used to implement chaining procedures to break down complex skills into smaller, teachable steps. This is something that's going to be individualized, and you cannot do chaining procedures without it. You can use this to teach any life skill, and it's technological because we're talking about procedures, detailed procedures, completing steps. In order for you to create and confirm the task analysis, you can do 3 different things. You can observe a competent person, consult with experts, or perform the task yourself. The task analysis assessment methods. So these are some of the methods that you can do in order to be able to test your task analysis. So there's single opportunity. This is going to assess the client's opportunity to perform each step in the task analysis. If the learner gets a negative, all next steps are stopped. Quicker, but underestimates the learner's ability. So basically here they only get one opportunity to go through the whole task list that you just created. And if they mess up in one of the steps, that's it, it's over. For multiple opportunity, this will be when it evaluates all the steps across the task analysis. If the learner commits an error, the teacher completes and prompts the next step. So this might take more time, but we have more information on the learner and their skill level. So this is that we obviously give them more than one opportunity, and we give them prompts for the next step. This actually gives us a more accurate understanding of where the individual is at based on their skill and their deficits and what steps it is that we have to clarify more. So here we have more. Continuing on to section G8, using chaining. So this is a continuation of the chaining. Here we have forward chaining. When we're doing forward chaining, the steps are taught in a naturally occurring order. We start with step 1. Once step 1 is mastered, then you can teach step 2, and it'll be doing step 1 and 2. This is really good if you want to link smaller chains into larger chains. The trainer completes the rest of the steps if you don't get them right, and the steps need to be completed in order, and it may take a long time to complete. So backwards chaining is that we're going to complete the last step first. So we will be doing all the steps for them, and they do the last step to contact reinforcement. Then you do all the steps minus the last 2, and so on and so forth. So basically you start from the last step. Well, they start from the last step, and we're completing all the other steps for them. And learners, this is good to use for learners that you know that need to come into contact with reinforcement. So for example, if you're teaching an individual how to do a puzzle, you want to do the whole puzzle for them and let them put the last step so they can come into contact with reinforcement faster. Next, we have total task chaining. This is when we can prompt them through all the steps. So they're going to be demonstrating the whole entire task themselves, and we'll just be giving them prompts to make sure that they get through all the steps. Every single step is taught every single time. And basically for backwards training, every single step is done every single time as well, just not by the learner. It will be all done by us, and then the learners will be doing the last steps. And for forward chaining, they won't be doing all the steps every single session. We could do today step 1, and then tomorrow we can do step 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. Not every single time that the chaining for forward chaining is implemented does the whole entire session have to be completed. So continuing on to total task chaining, it's a variation of forward chaining, and it's usually the most commonly used. And next we have backwards training with leaps ahead. So not every single step is trained. It's kind of like a probe method. It's good for saving time, and it's the same thing as backwards training, but not every step in the task analysis is trained. So continuation on section G8, using chaining. There's also 2 other variations. There's behavior chain with limited hold. And this is the time you have to complete the steps in order to gain reinforcement. So this is when you're kind of put on a time frame, and then plus you have to complete the steps too. So there's a certain amount of time that you have in order to be able to complete the steps in order to gain reinforcement. And then there is behavior chain interruption strategy. So this is when the chain is interrupted at a predetermined step so that another behavior can be emitted. This is something that you would use during MAND. This is great because things happen in life, in real life. So it teaches examples in that manner. So it's like putting an interruption in the middle of them doing their steps. And you're creating a CMOT, Condition Motivating Operation Transitive. And it's kind of like a negative reinforcement procedure. And here we are, moving on to section G9. It's used discrete trial, free operant, and naturalistic teaching arrangement. So discrete trial training, DTT, is a single cycle of behaviorally based and systematic instructional routine. You cannot measure DTT with rate. You need to have that opportunity to engage in a correct response. It's not free to occur. And they need our response to be able to respond. So they basically need a cue. They need an SD. An SD has to be present to engage them into doing the correct response. You use a derivative measurement for DTT. So you literally have one opportunity to engage in the correct response. There's only one correct answer. It's either you get it right or you don't. Tasks are broken down into small, simple, quick trials. So these are kind of like the steps that you would consider when you're doing DTT. So there's 5 steps. You would present the SD, provide a prompt if necessary. They give you a response, and you either reinforce or error correction procedure. So you let them know what they did incorrect and you correct them, and then when the session goes around again, you test to see if they got it correct or not. And there's an intro-trial interval. So it's like a break in between the next presentation. And this is something that's fast, it's conducted fast, it's teacher directed. That's why we are the SD. There has to be an SD present. And this is usually compared with incidental teaching, also known as naturalistic teaching, non-intensive institute training, or naturalistic teaching arrangements. And this is basically learning opportunities in everyday life. So this is more like student, child directed. So whatever they're doing, we're just following them around, and whatever's in their environment, we use that as a learning opportunity. If we're teaching them colors and they pick up a red truck, we'll be like, hey, what color is that? So this is incidental teaching in their natural environment. Section G10, teach simple and conditional discriminations. So simple discrimination is the 3-term contingency, what we've been seeing up to this point. There's an SD, the behavior, and a consequence. There's only one stimulus condition, and it exerts control over a response. The item itself is the SD for the response. So here we're going to have the antecedent, whatever the SD is, the behavior, and then a consequence. When we're talking about conditional discrimination, we're talking about a 4-term contingency. So there's going to be a conditional stimuli, whatever the SD is, the behavior, and then a consequence. And this is something that you'll see in matching to sample. So the sample stimulus, the correct comparison stimulus, the selection response, and reinforcement provided. So selecting the correct comparison is known as conditional discrimination, because discrimination between the comparison stimulus or stimuli is conditional on the sample stimulus presented on each trial. So basically, this is that it depends on the condition. So what's going on? Are we parking somewhere? Is it 5 p.m.? Are you allowed to park there before 5 p.m., after 5 p.m.? So you're still parking your car in the same section, but there's a sign that says after 5 p.m. You have to pay. So your consequence will change based on that. So if you park there in any other day, you'll be fine. But if it's after 5 p.m., then your consequence is going to change. You'll get a ticket, for example. That'll be a conditional discrimination. It depends on the condition. Just like the matching to sample. If you have a sample stimulus, if I show you the sample in this specific situation, you have to show me the correct sample back, and that's what's going to give you the reinforcement. Any other sample in that given time won't give you the reinforcement. We already went over the verbal operands, but here we're going to go into them one more time. The repetition is better. So section G11, it says use Skinner's analysis to teach verbal behavior. So here we have the antecedents, the verbal behavior such as mand, tact, echoic, interverbal, textual, and transcription, and the consequence. So all of them will have a generalized condition reinforcer. So something like praise, something that's a common reinforcer for everything else, like money. That is another generalized condition reinforcer. So they all have that same consequence except mand. For manding, the consequence has to be a specific reinforcer. Whatever it is that they're asking for, because that's what manding would be. They're requesting something that they want. They're demanding for something, which could be either done verbally or pointing, signing, whatever it is, that they're bringing attention to something that they want or need. And then the consequence would be the specific reinforcer. And the antecedent is going to be an MO. So some type of motivating operation, either they're satiated or deprived of something that's going to make them need it or want it. For the antecedent for tact, it's a nonverbal stimulus. So something is present in their environment. No verbal stimulus has to be given. There's just something there and they're able to label it. And this will get a consequence of a generalized condition reinforcer, usually praise. Good job. Yes, that is a bag of Doritos. Next, we have antecedent for echoic. This would be a verbal stimulus. So somebody will say apple. And if you're able to say apple back, having point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity, literally an echo, that would be an echoic verbal behavior. And the consequence will be a generalized condition reinforcer. Then we have interverbal. Interverbal is like having a conversation or asking questions and receiving answers. There's going to be no point-to-point correspondence or formal similarity. So this is like Mary had a little and then they have to say lamb, or twinkle twinkle little star. And this is also going to receive a consequence of a generalized condition reinforcer. Next, we have a verbal stimulus. This one would be written. So anytime you're thinking about textual, you're going to think about reading, something that has to do with reading. You're reading something. And it has point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity. Once again, consequence, generalized condition reinforcer. Next, we have transcription. This is transcribing. It has point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity. So this is going to have a verbal stimulus, vocal, something spoken. And you're going to be translating from something that's vocal to something written. So you're going to write out, you're going to transcribe. This is also going to receive a generalized condition reinforcer as a consequence. So G11, use Skinner's analysis to teach verbal behavior. This is a continuation of the previous slide. Once again, we've already gone over these terms in another slide, in another section, but here they are again. It's better this way repetition. So listener responding is something that I don't think that was in the other slide. Listener responding is basically when you have the listener following directions. So a verbal SD will be presented as the antecedent. The behavior will be a nonverbal behavior response to the SD, and the consequence will be a generalized condition reinforcer. That's listener responding. So if you're asking somebody for something, you're asking them something, telling them something, and they follow those directions, you're talking about listener responding. So we have codic, and that's when we have, codic would be like textual or transcription. So point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity, that would be codic. Duplic would be echoic, that it has point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity. And pure pure verbal operants. So when a man is pure, it's when they can man without a verbal SD, such as, what do you want? That would be a pure man. Then we have tact. A pure tact would be a tact that occur under the control of a non-verbal stimulus. a non-verbal SD. So it occurs without someone asking you, what is it? So in order for a tact to be pure, it would have to be they label something in their environment without any cues. Next, here we have autoclitic. So as a speaker, you are functioning as your own listener. Verbal behavior about your own verbal behavior. So this is like, oh, I know this. I think this. You're literally just speaking out loud about your own verbal behavior. I'm going to go do this. So this for yourself. This is complex. It's carrier phrase. And it makes language easier on listener. There's tact extensions and mand extensions. The tact extensions are generic extension, which is the basic stimulus generalization. This is when you teach dog for Frenchie, and the individual is able to tag dog for Doberman as well. Then there's metaphorical extension. This is a metaphor using like or as. And there's metonymical extension. This is like a note. There's no same features. You see a cup and you say water. Then there's syllistic extension, and this is like using slang. So using different languages that for you mean one thing and could be translated into something else using slang. So hey for yo, yo for hey. Mand extensions are superstitious mans and magical mans. So superstitious mans are reinforcement, sometimes occurs incidentally. So this specifies the behavior of inanimate objects. So this is kind of like when we're wishing, or we're saying something repeatedly, like car turn on, and then it just so happens to turn on. But it really doesn't have to do with us telling the car to turn on. It just so happened to turn on. So incidentally. And there's magical man. This is reinforcement has never occurred in the past. So this is like when you tell somebody, okay, bye, have a good day. And that doesn't mean that they're going to go home and have a good day. It's just a magical man, something that we say, and reinforcement has never occurred in the past. Section G12, use equivalence-based instruction. So stimulus equivalence. This is an emergence of untrained derived relations. So when you're taught something, and then you're able to come up with an untrained derived relation of whatever it is that you're taught. And there's some prerequisites to consider that you need in order to be able to do stimulus equivalence. And that's identical, which is like matching to sample. Apples have to be matching to apples. Then there's symbolic and arbitrary. So it's something about them evokes some response. There's a symbolic feature to them. They might not look exactly the same, but there is something that connects them to each other. And there's 3 parts to the stimulus equivalence: reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. Reflexivity is that A equals A. It's literally exactly the same thing, matching to sample. Then there's symmetry. This is when you do A equals B, and then you're able to do the opposite back. So if you're taught A equals B, you're able to do B equals A. You can flip it. And then there's transitivity. This is when you do A equals B and B equals C, and you're able to say A equals C at the end. So make your own underived relation based on the things that are taught to you. You're taught 2 different examples, 2 ways to connect things, and then you're able to associate your own connections between the other terms that are being taught. In order for you to be able to have stimulus equivalence, you have to have all 3 of these present. So there has to be an example of reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity in order for you to be able to deduce this as stimulus equivalence. So don't get that confused with transitivity. In order for it to be transitivity, it has to be A equals B and B equals C, and then you have to have a derived relation. Now, for it to be stimulus equivalence, there has to be an example of A equals A equals B, and B equals A, and transitivity as well for it to be considered stimulus equivalence. Section G13, use a high probability instructional sequence. So high P request sequence. This is when we have a high probability behavior, and then we get a low probability behavior to outcome from this. So the term or the theory that describes this is behavioral momentum. And how it works is that it presents 2 to 5 high probability, which would be like easy tasks, followed by a low probability task. High P must be in the individual's repertoire, and the goal is to gain compliance. So this is kind of like when you're like, okay, jump, touch your nose, clap your hands. Okay, now do one math problem. That would be the general idea of high P request sequence. So usually when you have them in this behavioral momentum where they're doing all these things and they're achieving them and getting reinforcement for them, they're more inclined to try to engage in a low probability behavior or a task. Section G14, use reinforcement procedures to weaken behavior. So one of them is the non-contingent reinforcement, NCR. NCR is used on a variable time or a fixed time. So this is variable time or fixed time does not rely on the occurrence of behavior. Reinforcement is received based on a time interval. So 5 minutes, every 5 minutes, reinforcement is given. It does not matter if the behavior occurred or did not occur. So no response is required. Intervention is independent of the learner's behavior. This does not teach an alternative behavior and may reinforce a problem behavior. It works because the reinforcer that maintain the behavior are freely available. There's 3 types of non-contingent reinforcement. There's non-contingent reinforcement with positive reinforcement, which is applying attention, giving a tangible, anything you are adding. And there's non-contingent reinforcement with negative reinforcement. So that's like escape. You give them a break on a timely basis. Every 5 minutes you get a break. It kind of avoids frustration during difficult tasks and hopefully allows them to engage for longer periods of time in their tasks. And there's non-contingent reinforcement with automatic reinforcement. So maybe a hug. You constantly give them hugs every 2 minutes in order to satiate that sensory function. So function does matter when we're referring to these types of procedures. Function is very important. Setting non-contingent reinforcement initially based on the criteria schedule. So there is total duration of all baseline responses over total number of problem behaviors. So this is how you would set the initial criteria for the schedule of setting non-contingent reinforcement. Next, we have functional communication training, FCT. This is usually used as a DRA. It's when you give a functionally appropriate alternative behavior to engage in instead of maladaptive behavior. There's a 2-step process for functional communication training, and that would be 1, conduct an FBA to identify the function of the behavior, and 2, provide appropriate alternative to access positive and negative reinforcement. You provide a functionally appropriate ways to communicate. You start with a dense schedule of reinforcement, and they must be able to understand the MOs to be able to apply this appropriately. Section G15, use extinction. So extinction is something that used to previously be reinforcing the behavior that is no longer reinforcing the behavior. So previously reinforced behavior that is no longer reinforced. Extinction is used to decrease or eliminate the target behavior. For extinction, you have to be able to let the full behavior happen. Section G16, use positive and negative punishment, timeout, response costs, overcorrection. So punishment is there's types of positive punishment. There's overcorrection, reprimand, exercise, contingent exercise, and response blocking. So overcorrection, there's 2 types, restitutional and positive practice. Restitutional is when you restore the environment to better than before. So it's like if a kid spills milk on the floor, you want them to clean up that milk and plus the whole entire house. That would be restitutional. And then there is positive practice. This is when they engage in a positive or correct behavior over and over again. So it's like writing on a piece of paper, I will not cheat on my test, I will not cheat on my test, I will not cheat on my test. So reprimand would be literally giving a reprimand. No, or stop, don't do this. That's a reprimand. And then there's contingent exercise. This is kind of like military. So you make them do exercise as a punishment procedure. So give me 20 jumping jacks or 20 push-ups. Then there's response blocking. So just keep in mind that this is different from extinction, because in extinction, they have to engage in the entire behavior. For response blocking, you block the whole behavior from occurring. And then in order to effectively use punishment, punishment must be used every time behavior occurs. And here we have the continuation of section G16. And here we're going to talk about the negative punishment. So something you like is taken away. So when we're talking about negative punishment, there's a couple of procedures. There's response cost. This is when there's a loss of a specific reinforcer. There's two types. It could be bonus or direct fine. Bonus response cost would be that you give additional time or more of something that can be taken away. You want them to know that their behavior has control. Then there's direct fine. This is the direct loss of a positive reinforcer. So this is like when you get a speeding ticket. So you're speeding, you're doing it because it gives you adrenaline or because you're trying to get somewhere fast, and then you get a ticket. And what happens? Your speeding is removed, or that adrenaline or wherever you're trying to get to, that reinforcing behavior that you're trying to do is removed from you. Next, we have timeout from reinforcement. So timeout, there's two types. There's non-exclusionary and there's exclusionary. When we're talking about non-exclusionary, we're talking about planned ignoring. So we literally remove attention from the behavior. Then there is contingent observation, which is that you would still be in the room, but you can't engage in the activity. Then there is timeout ribbon, and this is when a ribbon is given to you, and if you have a ribbon, you're allowed to earn reinforcement. And lastly, there's taking away items. Then we have the exclusionary timeouts, which would be in a room. So you're out of the actual room of where all the other students are, or where the activity is happening. So you're put into a whole separate room. Then there's hallway. So you get put into the hallway, so right outside the room, for example. And then there's partition. This is that you put it up so they can see what's happening. So there might be some kind of, you might be sitting on a seat, and then you're still seeing what is going on in the classroom. You're observing the activity, but you're not allowed to participate in it. Or maybe you turned around and you can hear everything that's happening, but you're not allowed to participate in it. Next, we have section G17, use token economies. So a couple of things that you need to know about the token economy is that there's a specified list of target behaviors. You have to have a specified list of the target behaviors. There has to be tokens or points that are generalized condition reinforcers. There has to be a menu of backup reinforcers that can be purchased with these tokens. So generalized condition reinforcers / tokens have to be durable. They can't be replicated. You have to determine how and when the tokens will be delivered. Many, but not all, use response costs. So in some of the token economies, there could be response costs. So you don't do this, okay, we're going to start removing some tokens. You have to be able to plan to fade it out from the beginning. You already have to have a plan of how you're going to fade out the token economy before you even start to implement it. And the individual must have the skills in their repertoire. Section G18, use group contingencies. So group contingencies are effective because they save time. They're more practical to use sometimes than just using a BIP for every single individual. There's 3 kinds of group contingency. There's independent group contingency, which is basically every man for themselves. Each person is responsible for themselves meeting the criteria. It doesn't matter if they didn't do it, as long as you do it, you'll get the reinforcement. The second type is interdependent group contingency. This is all or nothing. Each person needs to do their part for the whole group to get reinforcer. There's different things that go along with the interdependent group contingency, which is like the good behavior game. This is like boys versus girls or two teams in a classroom. Whoever meets the criteria gets a reinforcer. And this is under DRL, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior. And the third one is the dependent group contingency. This is where we have the hero. This depends on one person or a smaller group of larger group to meet criteria, so everyone gets a reward. You're picking a person who's going to carry the weight for everyone. So you have to be able to know that they can do it before you pick on them to be the hero for the group. Section G19, use contingency contracting. Contingency contracting, also known as behavior contracting, it's a physical document. You have to indicate that there's a behavior and what the reward for that behavior is going to be. A behavior contract is a permanent product because this is where the data is and where the results are, where the outcome is. So like a physical copy of the permanent product, the product that we want as the outcome. So both parties have to collaborate. There's delayed reinforcement. Response prompt, because you are defining what they need to do. There's more buy-in when the clients or stakeholders are in agreement with the plan. And that's why it's good to use a behavioral contract. You're establishing a plan where both of you guys are in agreement with some type of plan that they're going to be implementing on themselves. And there's more buy-in with this. There's a use, it's used in a treatment package. Something that has to obviously be fair. It has to be clear. We're talking about technological here. There's detailed steps and procedures on how to do every single step that you want them to do based on their plan and the behavior and their goals and whatever the target is and how it is that they're going to come into contact with the reward. So you have to be honest. If they complete the behavior, they must get the reward. They have to see that there's this type of reliability between them completing a behavior and receiving the reward. So you want to post the contract in a visible place. You want to have them be able to see it and refer back to it. Very important to remember that both of the parties have to sign. There has to be a signature, a consent. You want to regenerate the contract if either party is upset. So if someone is not in agreement with something that's in the plan, you want to regenerate it. You want to fix it. You want to change it up and make sure that everyone is in agreement with what's going on in the plan. You want to terminate the contract if it's complete or if either party fails to meet the terms. So we have to make sure that they are meeting the terms within the contract. There's 3 parts of a behavior contract. One of them is the behavior, and that is the behavior that needs to be engaged in by who. So these are the things that have to be specified. Who is the individual that has to be engaging in the behavior, by when, and how, and it has to be in their repertoire. You cannot create a behavioral contract if it's not something that the individual can do on their own. Number 2 is a reward. Who is delivering the reward? When, how, and what is the reward? All has to be specified in the contract. And the last thing is a task record. So how are you taking the data? There has to be information on how the data is being taken. Section G20, use self-management strategies. Self-management. Skinner referred to it as self-control as well. If the desired change in behavior did not occur, then self-management did not happen. So some of the benefits for self-management. There's access to internal private events. You can promote generalization and maintenance of behavior. It can be used for many behaviors. There's good self-management equals efficient, effective group environments. the ultimate goal of education. So this is where we want to end up in. We want to be able to have the individual be able to create some type of self-management plan and be able to follow through with it. We want them to be as independent as possible. Number 6 is free and independent. Since that's the goal, we want them to be free and independent. So antecedent self-management tactics that you can consider. So these are things that are very important to remember. If you're trying to use some tactics for self-management, you want to be able to manipulate the MOs. You want to provide response prompts. You want to perform initial steps of behavior change. Removing materials required for undesired behavior. Establish the limit of undesired behavior to certain stimulus conditions. Dedicating a specific environment for a desired behavior. And here we also have controlling response, which is a controlled response. Being able to control the response. And how do you do that? An example could be like you set an alarm. Why do you set an alarm? In order to wake up in the morning. Those are all types of self-management strategies. So section G20, use self-management strategies continued. Here's a little bit more on self-management. There's also self-monitoring. So this is a little bit different from self-managing because self-monitoring is referring to a procedure where a person observes their own behavior and records the occurrence or non-occurrence of the target behavior data. This goes with self-management. So self-management and self-monitoring are two things that go together. This is just how you collect the data on your own behavior. So self-management is the actual process of how you're going to manage yourself, and then self-monitoring is how you're going to collect the data on your own behavior. Here are the guidelines for self-monitoring. You have to provide materials that make it easy. Set yourself up for success with easy-to-use measurement systems. Give prompts, stimulus and response prompts. You want to collect data on the most important dimension of the behavior. Think about validity. You want to pick a valid measurement. So if you're tracking your weight loss, you don't want to measure how much time you're spending at the gym. You want to measure your weight loss. Then there's self-monitor early and often, as soon as possible. Other self-management tactics that are also known, and they're just added here for your needs to know. There's self-instruction, is generated verbal responses that function as a response prompt. These are questions you ask yourself to guide yourself through a behavior chain. There's habit reversal, so something incompatible with the target behavior. So this is like a DRI. Then there's self-directed systematic desensitization. This is when you're substituting one behavior for the unwanted behavior. It is a progressive muscle relaxation. Gradually expose yourself to situations that are fearful one step at a time. So you're putting yourself in extreme conditions or fearful situations in little increments in order for you to basically get used to whatever it is that you're not able to deal with. And lastly, there's mass practice. This is forcing yourself to perform an undesired behavior again and again. Sometimes this results in a decrease in future frequency of the behavior. So this is an example of this would be like compulsive behaviors. Section G21, use procedures to promote stimulus and response generalization. So there's strategies that you use to promote generalization, such as multiple exemplars, teaching loosely, the general case analysis, non-examples, and indiscriminable contingencies, mediation, and program for common stimuli. So exemplars refers to teaching sufficient stimulus examples. We want to be able to have stimulus generalization. So enough response examples, response generalization. When you're doing teaching loosely, you want to vary insignificant elements in the environment. So little things that don't have anything to do with the behavior, you want to vary those elements in order to be able to create a sense of different environments. Then there is general case analysis. This is what you would do in the beginning. This is when you analyze the case. This is what you do in order to be able to establish a program. So what you need to program, the steps, generative learning. How are you going to teach these strategies? That is what the general case analysis is. Then there's non-examples. This is for stimulus discrimination. This is when you teach examples and then non-examples. What are things that would not be that? Then there's indiscriminable contingency. This is when we want them to be able to do things in their natural environment. Need to be able to be flexible. There's two ways. You can do delayed rewards or intermittent schedules. So we want to give them reinforcement on an intermittent schedule. We want them to come into contact with reinforcement on a variable schedule, so they don't get reinforcement every single time that they engage in the behavior. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, which is what they're going to experience more naturally in their natural environment. Then there's mediation. This is when we want to maintain the behavior. This is when we're training the stakeholders, all those individuals who are part of the individual's plan. We want to train them all in order for them to be able to implement the plan when we're gone and to continue maintaining the behavior. And lastly, we have program for common stimuli. This is the same as stimuli in the real environment. We want to make the stimuli in the training similar to those in the real environment. Section G22, use procedures to promote maintenance. A behavior that once learned introduces the learner to new contingencies. So this is when we're referring to behavioral cusp, but we want to create behaviors that let us have behavioral cusp, behaviors that introduce the learner to new contingencies. So maintenance occurs when the learner continues to perform the target behavior after the intervention has been terminated. And that's what we aim for. This is our goal. And this is able to occur when the learner emits untrained responses that are functionally equivalent to the trained target behavior. So this would be like response generalization. This is what we aim for as well, response generalization. Then there's stimulus generalization as well. This occurs when the learner emits the trained response in an untrained setting or situation. And we have a strategy for achieving response maintenance is fading interventions responsibly. We want to be able to fade all the interventions slowly and decrease the intrusiveness of interventions, because if we do it too quickly, then we might mess up the process. So we want to be able to decrease them slowly and effectively using an effective fading system. I hope you aren't half asleep, and if you aren't, then here we are introducing section 8, selecting and implementing intervention. Let's get to it. Section 8.1, state intervention goals in observable and measurable terms. So particularly, this section wants you to be able to state intervention goals in observable and measurable terms. So when we're describing behaviors, we want to be able to describe them in ways that another person can also be able to say, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. You want to be very descriptive, so detailed in things that can be seen visually or described well enough for someone else to be able to replicate it. Things that are measurable. So if you say that an individual yells, okay, for how long? How long is the yelling? Are we measuring duration? And maybe we want to refer to the magnitude as well. How hard is it? How loud is it? Specifically in this slide, it gives you behavior, cusp, and pivotal behaviors. I'm not sure why this is included here, but whatever, we'll talk about it. Behavioral cusp is when we're introducing a whole new world. So it's when they engage in a behavior that introduces the individual to new contingencies, new environments. It's something that's going to be life-changing. And this is kind of like the goal. These are the goals that we want to reach. We want to be able to establish behaviors that are like behavioral cusp or like pivotal behaviors that will open new doors, that will be life-changing. Sometimes a behavior can be both. It can have behavioral cusp and pivotal behaviors. You don't have to think of behavioral cusp and pivotal behaviors as two completely different things or comparing one to another, because it's not really like that. They're just two terms that are similar and different at the same time, and you just have to know that they both exist and they can co-occur. So pivotal behavior is another goal. This is another intervention goal. We want to be able to establish behaviors that are pivotal. So generalization, these are behaviors that are demonstrated that are untrained behaviors. So it's a pivotal response training. This leads you to new behaviors, not new environments. So when you teach somebody how to use a microwave to make soup, and then they're able to also use a microwave to make, eggs, that would be a pivotal behavior. Section 8.2, identify potential interventions based on assessment results and the best available scientific evidence. So behavior analysts are scientists. We do not just make up data and interventions off of the top of our brains. We have to do research. We have to find scholarly articles, peer-reviewed articles, information. We need scientific evidence that these type of assessments will work, or that we have some type of backup, some type of research information that entails that this type of plan could possibly work for this individual. So behavior analysts recommend medical consultation when the behavior has potential of being medically related. This is something that we always want to weed out. We want to make sure that it's not a medical concern. But we also want to make sure that we identify potential interventions that are based on actual evidence, stuff that's read, that it has repeatability, that's been researched various times, that has proven to work, and that is effective for the specific behavior that's being introduced to us. Here we have section H3, recommend intervention goals and strategies based on such factors as client preferences, supporting environments, risk, constraints, and social validity. So whatever type of intervention goals that we recommend, we want to make sure that they fall under factors that are important, like client preferences. We don't want to establish an intervention goal that does not comply with what the client prefers, or that is not good for their environment. If the environment that they're in is not going to be supportive of the intervention goals and strategies that we're trying to implement, it won't work. This is a team. This works in a team. So if the parents involved in the client's intervention goals are not in compliance with those goals, they're not going to be met. We have to be able to consider the risk of these interventions. If they're too risky, if they will actually result in, if they're worth implementing, if the risk is worth it. We want to consider the constraints and the social validity. Is this going to actually bring a significant change to the individual's life? And is it worth doing this whole process? Is it going to benefit them eventually and at some future point enough to create a significant change? Also, here we have section H4. When a target behavior is to be decreased, select an acceptable alternative behavior to be established or increased. When we're implementing some type of procedure in order to decrease an unwanted behavior, we want to make sure that we also implement an alternative behavior to basically replace that unwanted behavior. We have to be able to replace that. We cannot just eliminate a behavior, decrease a behavior, and not support it with another one. So that's basically what section H4 is talking about. We want to establish or increase another behavior, a better behavior, something that we want them to do and engage in more to replace this other unwanted behavior that we're trying to decrease. Section H5, plan for possible unwanted effects when using reinforcement, extinction, punishment, and punishment procedures. So here we have all the unwanted effects of punishment. If you are a parent or anyone, a teacher, that's implementing punishment, it's negatively reinforced because the child's behavior decreases, so you're going to want to punish more. And this is something that you have to keep in mind. This is something that you want to mention to the parents, that you want to plan for as well. Sometimes when you implement the punishment procedures first, other than resorting to reinforcement first as we usually should, this is something that's going to give us results pretty quickly. It's going to decrease the problem behavior, but it's not giving a replacement behavior, and it's going to negatively reinforce the individual that's providing it. So you're going to try to implement punishment more. Another unwanted effect is behavioral contrast. So when you provide punishment in one setting, then a behavior might do the complete opposite in the other setting. So if you're doing it to decrease a behavior at home and it's not being implemented at the same time in another setting, then in the other setting, the behavior might skyrocket. And these are things that you have to obviously plan for. You have to get everyone on board. Some of the other things that you want to consider is that the effects may be temporary. So sometimes we implement this and the behavior may make a comeback. And these are things that have to be explained to those implementing the plan. You need to model punishment behavior. So this is also a bad thing because we have to model the unwanted behavior. You can become a punishing agent. So you can become aversive to this individual when you implement punishment procedures. It requires a lot of supervision, and you have to prepare for emotional outburst. Something else that's very important to keep in mind is that the highest magnitude, which would be the highest amount, that's how you want to apply this. So the highest magnitude, so the highest amount with the least intensity necessary to be effective. That's how you would implement this. Next, we have the unwanted effects of extinction. Things like extinction burst. Extinction burst is basically when you start to implement the plan, you're trying to decrease the behavior, and maybe let's say that it's a tantrum, and you start to try to eliminate the reinforcement for that behavior that used to receive reinforcement, and what's going to happen? They're going to tantrum 30 times worse, 30 times harder. That would be an extinction burst. It's going to skyrocket. The behavior's occurrence is going to skyrocket. And you just have to be able to tell the parents and all of those implementing this procedure that it's normal. It's part of the process. An extinction burst means that we're going through the process of extinction. Then there's also spontaneous recovery, which is kind of like after we have the implementation of extinction, the behavior extincts, and then all of a sudden it makes a comeback. This is a spontaneous recovery. Then there's reassurance. This is also something that could happen with extinction. So reassurance is when the behavior is put on extinction, but the individual still continues to try to engage in the behavior. So they're still trying to come into contact with reinforcement, even though reinforcement is not being provided, and they're still engaging in the behavior as they would if it were receiving reinforcement. So when a behavior that was put on extinction while a different alternative behavior was differentially reinforced comes back because alternative behavior was no longer reinforced. This happens because of the thinning of the schedule. DRA is something that we use with extinction procedures, and this is what makes the extinction procedures more effective. We want to put a behavior on extinction, but we also want to implement an alternatively functional behavior. There's also extinction-induced aggression. A lot of aggressive behavior might come out of this, and there might be escape and avoidance. So once again, all these unwanted effects are things that you just want to mention and you just want to plan for. Then there's unwanted effects of reinforcement. Things that could happen is like behavioral contrast. Is the rate of responding in one setting goes the opposite direction in another setting that's not being reinforced. So same thing as punishment. Both of these have the behavioral contrast effect. So the name is given by what happens to the behavior in an unplanned, non-intervention setting. So some other things that you want to take into consideration is that the individual might rely on the contrived reinforcer. So they might be relying on these reinforcers in order to engage in behaviors. They become dependent on these reinforcers. And you just have to plan for that. You just have to vary reinforcers, maybe not provide reinforcers every time, and exchange them for more naturally occurring ones. And then these effects on reinforcers can be temporary. So just like punishment, it could be a temporary procedure. There's also ethical concerns. They must be in an aversive event for a negative reinforcement. That you have to consider that when we're referring to specifically negative reinforcement. In order for them to engage in negative reinforcement procedures, they have to already be in an aversive event. Then there is society thinks of it as bribery. So a lot of times people think of reinforcement procedures as bribery because they think that we're using a reinforcer in order to get them to do something. But bribery is something that happens before the behavior. And reinforcement is a consequence. It happens after the behavior. So just keep that in mind as well. And lastly, another unwanted effect is that it could be potentially harmful if not done correctly. Section H6, monitor client progress and treatment integrity. So there's 7 steps to effective base supervision. There's identify desired consumer outcome, specify what staff must do to assist consumer in attaining the desired outcome, train the staff in performance skills specified in step 2. This is your staff intervention success. You want to monitor your staff's performance. You want to support proficient staff performance, correct non-proficient staff performance. And once you have already trained all of these steps, you need to be able to evaluate and reinforce the people implementing your plan. There's 2 types of evaluation methods. There's direct observation and indirect methods, which would be like self-reporting, questionnaires, behavior rating scales. And the last one, number 7, is continuously evaluate staff performance. And this will allow us to have procedural fidelity, procedural integrity, treatment integrity. And there's 4 ways to create treatment integrity. That's to specify, train, monitor, and reinforce. This is how you know you are providing quality service. This is clinically significant outcomes are what are going to make something effective. So new skills, challenging behaviors are reduced. Individual/staff is motivated and reinforced. IOA does not measure treatment integrity, only measures whether 2 people observe the behavior happened or not. So very important for you to monitor your client's progress, and you do this by being able to effectively train and supervise your team and make sure they're carrying out your plan the way you establish it to be carried out. And you want to obviously monitor their progress and see where they're at. Weekly check up on your data collection, see where they're at, check in with your RBTs, with your supervisees, with the parents, and make sure that you always know what's happening to make sure that the treatment has integrity and that things are being implemented how they should be and that everyone's understanding the plan. Section H7, make data-based decisions about the effectiveness of the intervention and the need for treatment revision. So all of your decisions should be based on data, collected data, observations. What is the individual doing? Where's the behavior going? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Were you able to establish a behavior? Were you able to make a replacement for it? Is the behavior change treatment working? Is it not working? Is it displaying what it's supposed to be displaying? So the importance of treatment integrity is that it strengthens the believability that the independent variable actually influences the dependent variable. This relates to the consumer outcome. It reduces confounds in the research study, and you want to make sure you provide feedback to staff immediately and have them and give them positive and certain feedback. You want to make sure that everybody knows what's going on and that all the decisions are being made on data collection. Section 8. Make database decisions about the need for ongoing services. It's important to document behavior services you provide to meet requirements of the law and of your organization, to ensure accountability and to facilitate further services by you or other professionals. You want to ensure that the learner is coming into contact with reinforcement from the natural environment, and this will allow you to promote response maintenance. So based on the data collections, based on the graphs, based on all of that information is how you're able to assess if the services should continue to go, if the services need to be continued, if the individual needs more services, if they don't, if the parents are being compliant, if they're following along with the plan, if your team is following along with the plan, and if you're actually making effective outcomes and getting effective results based on the data that you've been collecting. Okay, section H9. So for those that are taking the BCABA, this is one of those sections that you do not need to worry about. It's not in the BCABA task list. So this is for the BCBAs taking the BCBA exam. So section H9 is collaborate with others who support and or provide services to client. The individuals who are identified as the client is a service recipient, an organization, a parent. The behavioral contract's effects can be minimized by providing alternative desirable behaviors. Indirect consumers are the parents, the teachers, organization. Direct consumers are the service recipients. So other than that information that we have listed there, you want to be able to collaborate with all these individuals mentioned here, with everyone involved in the client's plan. Because if everyone's on board, then the plan will roll out how it's supposed to. We want to make sure that everyone has buy-in, that everyone is being reinforced and receiving feedback and being trained on the procedures in the plan in order to promote maintenance. And here we have the last and final section, section I, personnel, supervision, and management. Woohoo! For section I have combined section I1, I2, and I3 here together because kind of basically these three sections are referring to the same thing. So here they are. This is state the reason for using behavior analytic supervision and the potential risk of ineffective supervision. There's established a clear performance expectation for the supervisor and supervisee. And section I3, which is select supervision goals based on an assessment of the supervisee skill. So all of this is done through staff competency-based training, BST. So there is 4 things that you have to remember for this. There is instruction. You want to describe to them. You want to explain the why. You want to provide a rationale on the target skills. You also want to explain why and provide written instructions of the target skills. And next, you want to model. When we're talking about model, we're talking about demonstrating. As a trainer, you model the skills as close as you can to the condition it will be used in. You can use a direct model, so you yourself can model it for them in person. Or you can use a video model, role play. These are all ways that you can model. Next, you want to do a rehearsal. After you've done the instructions, you showed them a model, you demonstrated them the behavior, you want to have them rehearse. You want to observe them doing what you just showed them. The supervisee will now rehearse the skill that you previously modeled and be able to demonstrate it in a contrived setting and on the job. And lastly, we have feedback. You want to give them immediate feedback. You want to repeat this until they have conquered mastery of the skills that you're showing them. So there's constructive criticism should be given on how to improve the skills and become more proficient. Rehearsal and feedback are circular. These are steps that are repeated until the supervisee shows mastery of the skills. If they aren't getting it, then you would have to go all the way back to step 1 until they get what it is that you're teaching them. You do not want to send a supervisee out into the field without them knowing what it is that they're supposed to be doing, because you're not only putting them in an uncomfortable position, but you're also jeopardizing your client. Next, we have systematic performance monitoring for supervisors accomplishes 2 goals. The first goal that it accomplishes is that it provides a means for evaluating staff performance and program implementation. The second goal is that it exhibits a program's effects on the individual's target behavior. Remember that client success is equal to staff success. We will have client success if all the staff is successful as well. There's 4 ways to effectively monitor staff performance, and that's inform. You would inform the staff that they're being monitored and why. You want to be friendly. You want to be kind. You want to be polite. Be courteous to your staff. Number 3 is overt. You want to let them know. You want to monitor them overtly, because if you monitor them covertly, in secret, the monitoring brings negative feelings, so they might feel weird that you're secretly monitoring them, that you monitored them out of nowhere. So you want to give them a heads up that they're going to be monitored. And lastly, there's feedback. Feedback should be given to staff as soon as possible after they are monitored. Next, we have measuring staff performance. These are the ways that you can measure staff performance: through time sampling, short observation times, and it's less stressful to the staff. You can also do evaluating data collection. You can evaluate their data, the data that they've been collecting, and make sure that they've been implementing the correct procedures, and if they haven't, correct the procedures. Next, we have permanent product. That's another way you can measure staff performance, and it's behavior measured through the environment. You can use video recordings, paperwork. It's less invasive and easier for staff. Lastly, on this slide, we have supervision of behavior change agents. You supervise only within your areas of competency. You only take on a volume of supervisory activities that is commensurate with your ability to be effective. You only give your supervisee those responsibilities that such a person can responsibly be expected to perform competently, ethically, and safely. If supervisee does not have the skill, you have to provide conditions to acquire the skills. And lastly, you ensure that supervision and training are behavior analytic and content, effectively and ethically designed, and meet the requirements for licensure, certification, or other defined goals. Section I-4, train personnel to competently perform assessment and intervention procedures. And Section I-5, use performance monitoring, feedback, and reinforcement systems. So this is here together. This occurs when staff change their behavior while they are in the presence of their supervisor. So we kind of already hit bases on all of these things in detail, but reactivity is what happens when the staff change their behavior when they're being in the presence of their supervisor. Informal monitoring. This is when you're making a quick performance observation without using a prepared tool. And then there's formal monitoring. This is systematically observing a designated aspect of staff work performance. And here we have the very last slide that contains I-6, I-7, and I-8. For those of you that are taking the BCABA, the section I-8 is not on your task list, so you don't have to worry about section I-8. So section I-6 is use a functional assessment approach to identify variables affecting personnel performance. Section I-7 is use function-based strategies to improve personnel performance. And section I-8 is evaluate the effects of supervision on client outcomes on supervisee repertoires. So I would say that all of section I is kind of like together. And we've kind of mentioned all of this already in the first portion of this section. But here we have it summarized one more time. Kind of all of this ties one with another. It's important to supervise and monitor and train your staff as effectively as possible, and you can use functional assessments and function-based strategies to be able to improve their performance. So number 1 is identify desired consumer outcome. Number 2, specify what staff must do to assist consumers in attaining desired outcomes. 3 is train staff in the performance skills specified in step 2. Number 4 is monitor staff performance. Number 5 is support proficient staff performance. Number 6 is correct non-proficient staff performance. And number 7 is continuously evaluate staff performance. And that is all. That was the whole entire second part of the task list. I hope that you guys found this material useful for your study journey. And I hope that you guys also saw section 1, because there's 2 parts to this video. There's section 1 that has the first part of the task list, and this is section 2. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching Puzzle Me Academy in order for you to study for your tests. Please leave comments, questions, concerns, reach out to us. All the comments and information that you guys have is awesome for us. So thank you so much for watching, and bye-bye.